I'm very pleased to welcome Chad Wellmon to the podium. Chad is Associate Professor of German Studies and History at the University of Virginia and a faculty fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in Culture. His primary research and teaching areas include European intellectual history, Romanticism, media, and social theory. Chad did his work at Davidson and at Cal Berkeley and is the author, editor, and translator of 5 books, the most recent of which is Interacting with Print, Elements of Reading in an Era of Print Saturation, which is forthcoming from the University of Chicago Press next year. Chad's presentation will be followed by a response from Alan Jacobs. Alan is my longtime friend and colleague here in the Honors College at Baylor. He is Distinguished Professor of Humanities here. But the truth is, Alan knows something about everything. The author of more than a dozen books, he is a superb scholar and a superb colleague. And Baylor is very grateful to have him here. We courted Alan for a long time. I felt like the guy that keeps walking across the dance floor at the junior high dance trying to get the pretty girl to come, and we finally got him here, and we are very happy to have Alan with us. Chad, we look forward to your presentation. Thank you very much.
Good morning. Thanks so much for coming. And Darren, Darren, thank you for the invitation, and to the Institute for Faith and Learning. My goal here is quite simple, and it's to run out the clock so that Alan will not have time to eviscerate me at the end, so good luck. What I want to do today is talk about an experience I've had over the past 2 years at the University of Virginia as chair of the, the General Education Reform Committee. It was brutal. I'm going to talk about why. So on November 19th, 2014, Rolling Stone published an article describing the brutal gang rape of a University of Virginia undergraduate in a campus fraternity house. After the allegations were largely proven false, the magazine retracted the story, and Rolling Stone... That had an angle on it. Sorry about that. We're good. It's Rolling Stone exacting its revenge from what I'm about to say. And Rolling Stone is now being sued for defamation. Less than an hour after the story was published on Rolling Stone's website, I walked into a classroom of 50 UVA undergraduates. They were visibly stunned and wanted to talk about the article. And so, for more than an hour, I led a discussion that ranged from angry denunciations of UVA's Greek culture to tearful laments about a university gone astray. My students had read the story as a commentary on their university, as a commentary on their lives. Later that afternoon, I, like the rest of my colleagues, received an email from Teresa Sullivan, our university president, and here I'll just read from that email. I am writing in response to the Rolling Stone magazine article that negatively depicts the University of Virginia and its handling of sexual misconduct cases. Negatively depicts? This was the language in the first email from our institution, committed to nothing but its own mechanisms. There was no evidence of the virtues to which UVA routinely lays claim in its glossy admissions brochures and earnest fundraising pleas: empathy, civic concern, leadership, and curiosity. The story, as I said, would prove to be largely fabricated. But I had just left a classroom of angry, confused, and distraught 18-year-olds. And our president's primary concern was with the public image of the university. My students longed for community, and all they were offered was a missive from the bureaucratic bowels of an accounting machine. There were no people in this statement, just interest. No judgments, just initiatives. No moral failures, just sexual misconduct issues. 2 days later, I walked into another room full of equally stunned and silent people. But these were my faculty colleagues from the College of Arts and Sciences, who had come to the second meeting of the gloriously titled Committee on General Education Reform, which my dean had just asked me to lead. In the weeks and months that followed, my colleagues and I took up our dean's charge to, and I'm quoting him, reimagine undergraduate education for public universities in the 21st century. That was our task. And we did so by reflecting on one question: what could bind students and faculty together at a public university in 2016? After the Rolling Stone story broke, we realized, my colleagues on this committee, that we had been trained to write articles, trained to run labs, and to speak with our disciplinary colleagues around the world. But we had not been trained to talk with our students about their moral lives, about the relationship between what they learned and how they lived, about the aims and purposes of education. In fact, most of us had been trained to be skeptical, if not downright suspicious, of that very possibility. Were questions about the purposes, ends, and ethical shape of education legitimate areas of concerns for historians, for biologists, for chemists, much less for professors? We were, after all, professionals. Now, when our students wanted to discuss the Rolling Stone article or the assault of a young black undergraduate student by state police only a few months later, my colleagues and I could offer them personal words of solace in our office hours. But as an institution, all we had to offer were morally vacuous statements and a lesson in brand management. And we certainly had no curriculum, at least not in the historical sense of that term, as a shared path that made explicit claims and demands about the types of people we wanted our students to become. Like most universities, or at least most public universities, UVA's curriculum is a series of formal categories into which faculty and students alike are that carve up their academic and intellectual lives. A few social science courses here, a few math and science courses here, and a sprinkle of humanities. Undergraduates graze upon an assortment of classes that typically do not cohere or provide any common experience. Such a checkbox curriculum also ensures that faculty members remain segmented, institutionally in terms of their departmental affiliations, but also subjectively in terms of their scholarly lives. As scholars, our real commitments are to the international disciplinary networks to which we belong, not the local corporation of students and fellow faculty members. And so my colleagues and I began with what might, on first hearing, sound like a rather anodyne premise. A curriculum, we asserted, was not just a formal list of requirements, it was an assertion of values, an assertion of purpose, and a claim of commitment. It was a statement of what a faculty holds dear and true, what is worth knowing, conserving, sharing, stewarding, and defending. And this statement led, as I said, to the most difficult 2 years of my life. It was exhausting, it was rewarding, and it was brutal. And I think, and as I'm wont to do, I'm going to think about this conceptually and historically so as to distance myself from it. I'm just going to be honest. I'm not going to go and tell you about the times I was found in tears in the faculty club after faculty meetings, the times I was called a bigot, a moral outrage. We can talk about those over drinks somewhere. So, since 2000, Harvard, Stanford, Texas, Chapel Hill, and myriad other universities, both public and private, have undertaken similar projects. Committees have issued reports lamenting the lack of a coherent common experience and the absence of a shared intellectual project. Many failed. Faculty voted against the proposals. Some succeeded. Faculties voted to enact some of the proposals. But most, quite simply, withered away. Delayed votes, infinitely reconstituted committees, or, most importantly, faculty exhaustion. This morning, I want to understand why. And I'm not really going to talk about the curricular proposal that we submitted at UVA. I can in Q&A if we want. Many of my colleagues in the academy, especially those in the humanities and humanistic social sciences, claim that the greatest threat facing universities today is what some people call neoliberalism, the vague financial and political forces that are remaking universities in the image of international corporations. I'd say there's a good deal of truth about that, but I want to qualify these claims. If universities increasingly do operate according to purely economics ends, I would suggest it is because they lack a robust conception of the kind of good education and knowledge might be. It is a failure of our collective imaginations. And this failure can be traced back, I would suggest, to the late 19th century, when the modern research university eclipsed the classical American college as the most important cultural institution of higher learning and knowledge in this country. As research universities such as Johns Hopkins, Harvard, Michigan, or Cornell grew in national and international prominence in the 1880s and 90s, their critics and advocates alike, however, began to worry that something was missing in American higher education, something that many presumed the classical American college and its common curriculum had afforded. Sorry. This isn't level, just so you know. I'm going to do this. Something was missing, a unified, harmonious knowledge. And by 1920, university faculty had begun to tout general education programs as the best way to fill the void left by the rapid decline of the American college. Today, deans and members of committees like the one I chaired at UVA consider general education as a problem to be solved. But actually, general education was a solution to a problem in the early 20th century. General education was touted as the solution to a cultural problem, to deep anxieties about the purpose of education and knowledge in a modern age. Now, for most of the 19th century, aspiring American postgraduates trekked off to German universities in Berlin, Leipzig, and Bonn to study with world-renowned philologists or chemists. And when they returned, they helped establish Harvard, Chicago, Stanford, Cornell, Michigan, and Clark as research universities, transforming Harvard College into Harvard University, thereby transforming American higher education from a primarily undergraduate affair devoted to forming morally upright white Protestant men into a system of knowledge production and postgraduate research. Although many American academics earned their degrees in Germany and extolled the virtues of Wissenschaft upon their return, Wissenschaft never translated well. In Wissenschaft, and I'm going to talk about this for a few minutes, Wissenschaft refers, of course, not just to the physical or natural sciences, but to any, in the English sense, but to any systematic account of knowledge, or at least it did in the 19th century. And what really didn't translate from German to English was the culture of Wissenschaft, a culture that was bound up with Prussian neo-humanism and the 150-year history of the German Research University. Wissenschaft, or systematic knowledge, scholarship, was embedded in a distinct social system with its own rituals, practices, norms, institutions, and just as importantly, notions of what counted as real authoritative knowledge and how that knowledge had its own epistemic virtues that made it possible. Every German Wissenschaftler, that is, every German scholar, and when I say Wissenschaftler, I also mean the bureaucrats that filled the Prussian civil service. I mean, we can't even imagine this, right? Every German Wissenschaftler had been educated in the classical gymnasium. This is like the lycée in France, right? This is the secondary school, and could read and write in Greek and Latin. But more importantly than reading and writing in Greek and Latin, they shared a common culture and a faith, however vague and implicit, in the power of ancient cultures to provide norms and ideals for the present. Wissenschaft didn't just produce knowledge, it guided right action, formed people, and provided meaning. And perhaps most importantly, it offered a form of transcendence. It offered the promise of a community that exceeded any particular place and time. And just as an aside, I think Nietzsche's story, I'm sure most of us know Nietzsche's story in the gay or the joyous science of the madman declaring God is dead. I would say that that's a story not only about the death of a Christian monotheistic God, but it's the story of the decline and collapse of this culture that I'm describing here. But that's a different story for another book, and we can talk about that in a minute. So I just don't want to set up Wissenschaft as this perfect monolithic culture. It died and collapsed around the same time that the American college did, but for, I think, distinct reasons. My point is simply this. The cultural norms and practices of Wissenschaft that all these Americans went and imbued and came back and tried to bring over to America, it didn't translate. And especially it didn't translate to American East Coast Protestant culture. And what didn't translate was the peculiar Prussian admixture of humanism and highly specialized knowledge that had defined German intellectual culture for over a century. Now, Americans had their own forms of humanism, but they were bound up with undergraduate education that was never the case in Germany. In the late 19th century, the reformers of American higher education made a fateful decision. Despite their spirited disagreements about the ultimate ends the ultimate purposes and structures of the research university, American university presidents from Yale's Noah Porter and Princeton's James McCosh to Hopkins' Daniel Coit Gilman and Harvard's Charles Eliot all agreed that the new institution, the research university, should not be confused with the undergraduate college. The research university advanced knowledge, and the college formed morally upright students. And this institutional separation, I'd like to suggest, of knowledge from ethics ultimately debilitated both institutions. And we're suffering from that today, and we have been for the past 100 years, I would say. But what was this institution that many feared the research university was on the verge of destroying around 1900? What was the classical American college? And most importantly, how did it conceive of the ends of education and the purposes of knowledge? Until the end of the 19th century, American college curricula were organized around a common set of prescribed courses, emphasizing training in Latin and Greek language, mathematics, and moral philosophy. The purpose of a college education, as the Yale Curriculum Report of 1828 put it, was to provide, quote, the discipline and the furniture of the mind. The decision to teach Latin and Greek and not French and German was based on the assumption that the study of these ancient languages better exercised the mind. They best taught, and I'm quoting directly from the report here, the art of fixing attention and directing the train of thought. It's as though they were talking about how to live in the internet age, right? It was a matter of attention, and Greek and Latin taught you how to dole out that attention. The mental acuity was a force that could simply be redirected like some Freudian libido. Now, the ideal of mental discipline was the central ethical and epistemic end of a college education, and it was tied in complicated ways to the broader moral idiom of mainline American Protestant culture, which, in case you haven't gotten it yet, was not equivalent to German Protestant culture. Mental discipline was an ethical idea that stood in for the premise that the human mind was the basis of all knowledge and the source of all basic truths. Mental discipline also referred to the process through which the mental faculties were perfected through rigorous exercise. And it was the language of exercise, the language of habituation, the language of repetition. The more Greek verbs you studied, the more acute, both mentally and morally, you would become. It was both the product and process of a proper education. And the ultimate end of this disciplinary regime was the perfection of the faculties as a reflection of the unity of nature, thus presuming an analogy between natural and moral laws, both divinely given. Now, the coherence of these curricular programs was based on what 19th century scholars and faculty members assumed, and it was an assumption, it was a premise, to be the unity of knowledge. But the unity of knowledge for these scholars had two distinct but related aspects. First, that all truth claims, regardless of the provenance, regardless of whether they were scientific, moral, or religious in nature, could ultimately be integrated. And two, that these truth claims, so integrated, had by definition a moral effect. Truth was not simply a description of the world or a claim about the divine. Truth had the power to change who you were. The college experience was epitomized by the senior moral theology seminar, usually taught by the college president, who was always a minister. And it was a systematic mix of ethics, science, and religion applied to big questions like the nature of virtue, what is a good character, and the unity of the human soul. And the curriculum also, and this will be important later in the story, had broad social implications as well. Intellectual order was presumed to be necessary not just for the moral character of an individual, but as a buffer, and I'm quoting from several of these 19th century figures here, as a buffer against cultural chaos. That was the fear. Mental discipline was the fortifying force of an American culture. The purported unity of the classical American college was, of course, broadly religious, in the sense that colleges were total institutions that cultivated a common established Protestant culture that paired a common curriculum with required chapel, prohibitions against, quote, unmanly behavior, stringent disciplinary regimes, which included many things, including at the University of Virginia, stringent regulations about how you handled the slaves that you brought with you as undergraduates to school. But colleges typically did not share sharply articulated doctrinal commitments, or even until the very late 19th century, sharply defined denominational identification. That's kind of an irony in the history. Denominational identification only picked up in the last few decades of the 19th century. Colleges were often extremely hesitant to express explicit denominationally contentious positions, lest, and I'm quoting from the presidents of mid-19th century universities, basically, I'm summarizing what they say, lest they offend tuition-paying parents. If we're too explicit about our Christian commitments, we might offend and thus not receive the tuition that we desperately need. Because, for anyone who would want to accuse me of recounting a story of decline, the 19th century American college was a shambles. The broader story of the antebellum, in particular American college, is largely one of perpetual crisis, low enrollments, and government bailouts. Before 1800, Harvard had been bailed out by the state of Massachusetts over 100 times. Harvard was a public university funded by the state that got rich enough to become private. And the populations of these colleges were highly homogeneous and excluded women, people of color, Catholics, and Jews, and thus, I would suggest they are not the apposite models for us today, for a host of reasons. By the last third of the 19th century, however, the tenuous unity of college curricula started to come undone, with three factors that I just want to highlight before moving on. First, university presidents, with Harvard's Charles Eliot, and Brown's Francis Wayland leading the way, introduced the elective system, which encouraged students, and this is beginning in the 1860s and then going through the 1890s, which encouraged students to choose their own classes, to follow their own intellectual interest, and even, to quote Eliot, craft their own religious experiences. The commitment to electives, as Wayland explained, meant, and I'm quoting directly from Wayland here, this is Brown's president, meant that the various courses should be so arranged, insofar as it is practicable, every student might study what he chose, all that he chose, and nothing but what he chose. And so, by the end of the 19th century, choice became the primary virtue of American higher education. Not much has changed. Second, the fairly nebulous religious consensus undergirding American colleges started to come undone. And I think one of the best examples of this is a debate between Princeton's John McCosh and Harvard's Charles Eliot in New York City in 1884, where they agree that religion, and the topic was, what is the appropriate relationship between religion and higher education in America? It was billed as a debate. They agreed that every college absolutely had to have religion. But of course, the rub was, what did you understand by religion? McCosh, of course, understood a rather kind of anodyne established Protestant culture, and Charles Eliot understood religion as what he would later call the new religion, a religion shorn of miracles, a personal God, and any doctrinal detail, what the Germans and English would have called in the 18th century natural religion. And third, and this is a much longer story, but I think it's fascinating, another challenge to the American college was actually the rise of what they called collegiate life, that is the rise of fraternities, drinking, and football. This is when the extracurricular life of students began to eclipse the curricular life of students, and it was a crisis. And if you want to read a good detail of this, read Veblen's The Higher Learning in America, where he details how this came about, where once the curriculum collapsed, the students created their own common culture. It was drinking and football, right? So even as many welcomed the prestige and productive power of the new research universities, many faculty and higher education leaders began to voice widespread discontent about the effect they were having on undergraduate education. Colleges and everything they stood for, wrote Benjamin Wheeler, president of the University of California, much later in 1926, what they stood for, liberal education and a uniquely American commitment to moral character, had, quote, exited the scene by 1900. And just as the university ascended and the college declined, the anxious advocates of the college ideal began to evoke another term for what was missing in American education, what was coined, general education. And in the first several decades of the 20th century, faculty members across the country designed new curricular programs in an attempt to recover this lost, what they thought was this lost epistemic and ethical idea, the unity and coherence of knowledge and moral life. These programs were surrogates for what had been broadly religious-based visions of the unity of knowledge, the unity of learning, and the unity of culture. But of course, faculty members rarely agreed on exactly what was missing or what constituted this unity. Over the course of the 20th century, faculty invoked general education to refer to a whole host of things. Liberal as opposed to professional education, a common or foundational knowledge, the great books, or an awareness and capacity to engage in pressing problems or issues of the day. Right? These are old debates. So Columbia University established one of the first general education programs shortly after the Armistice in 1919, and over the following 2 decades developed the renowned Contemporary Civilization and Humanities A and B courses. Now, Contemporary Civilization had an interesting beginning because originally it was designed, and I'm just quoting from the course catalog here, as Allied Apologetics, right? It was an apology course for American involvement in the First World War. It was designed and taught as a year-long course that focused, I'm quoting again from the course description, present-day problems. It was profoundly presentist. So that's happening at Columbia, and then think of its sister course, its more famous perhaps, Humanities A and B courses. The core sequence emerged out of a great books course originally taught by an English professor named John Erskine to acquaint, and again quoting from his syllabus here, to acquaint immigrant students to the great Anglo-Saxon writers. And over the following 2 decades, Erskine's courses gradually evolved into the more famous Colloquium on Important Books, taught by Jacques Barzun and Lionel Trilling, which became, of course, Humanities A and B, and was in 1937, and then in 1947 was required of all Columbia College students. Now, much of Columbia's faculty believed that the imposing presence of the research university required a counterbalance in the form of a unified curriculum for undergraduates that also brought faculty together. But they offered 2 starkly different solutions. Contemporary Civilization focused on the present and the changing situation of humans, right? Kind of eschewed this notion of a permanent human nature or human soul, whereas the humanities sequence focused on a highly selective canon of text thought to reveal the unchanging nature of the human. The Columbia debate quickly spilled into the broader press. In 1922, the New Republic published a series of 6 articles devoted to the crisis in undergraduate education in America. Several authors lamented, and I'm just quoting from some of the articles here, the centrifugal forces tearing American universities and American culture apart. Now, and while some blamed Eliot in the introduction of the elective system, others argued that the curricular confusion of American colleges was ultimately a consequence of the fragmenting effects of modernity. The most daunting task, wrote one author, was to recover the unification of knowledge that had been undone by modernity. Now, this battle only really got going at the University of Chicago. And here at the University of Chicago, their curricular debate was a battle in which the stakes were not just curricular, but metaphysical, ethical, and political. And this is where the Chicago that, at least if you're like me, the Chicago that you know and love, this is where it starts to take shape. Because until then, it was a Baptist football powerhouse in a lot of respects, right? Oh, I could have made a joke about that, right? So in 1931, a group of faculty, frustrated by the mediocre academic quality of Chicago's undergraduates and the power of football over the campus culture, introduced what they called the New Plan, a new curriculum organized around a 4-year-long survey of courses covering the university's 4 divisions: biology, the biological sciences, the physical sciences, the humanities, and the social sciences. And by 1935, the leader of that committee, the Dean Chancey Boucher, could argue that the new plan's intellectual rigor had lowered time to degree, which it had, and perhaps most importantly, at least for the committee, he could point out that Chicago's vaunted football program had collapsed and been closed. But the new plan had a powerful critic. And this is kind of ironic because this critic is now heralded as the great inventor of the core curriculum. That critic, of course, was Robert Hutchins, Chicago's new president, who was appointed at the age of 29 after he left Yale Law School and arrived in Chicago. And he immediately began discussions that would eventually result in the collapse of the new plan. Soon after his arrival, Hutchins began collaborating with a young and feisty philosopher named Adler on a great books honors course modeled on Erskine's Columbia course, right? Before his arrival at Chicago, Adler had been developing a methodology and taxonomy for organizing all sciences and fields of knowledge, a project inspired by the metaphysics of the medieval scholar St. Thomas Aquinas. Now, Adler, a New Yorker from a Jewish family, mined Thomas for permanent rational categories of knowledge and a timeless conception of human nature. Attracted to Adler's encyclopedic aspirations and his grandiose academic ambitions, Hutchins enlisted him in a plan to remake the University of Chicago, and thus was born the Great Books program. Now, between 1934 and 35, Hutchins began a direct assault on the new plan, delivering a series of talks and speeches to faculty and alumni, which he consistently claimed that all those supporters of the new plan, all they were interested in was pouring, I'm quoting from, facts into students' head and accumulating data. What followed was a highly personal and agonistic debate about the role of research in modern scholarship and undergraduate education. But the curriculum debate was really a proxy for a broader debate about the ends of modern knowledge and the purpose of the university. Even the Daily Maroon, the undergraduate student newspaper, got involved, mostly by mocking the defenders of the new plan as mindless positivist, endlessly accumulating data. Now, Adler and Hutchins' Great Books program juxtaposed the humanities with the natural and social sciences and claimed that the humanities were the only legitimate source for moral and epistemic guidance. Everything else was, as they said, mere empiricism. The real object of derision, however, I think, was the very idea that German Wissenschaft, that scholarship, and the concept of knowledge as research, of knowledge not as something to be revealed, but rather as something to be created and infinitely pursued. The challenge was that that would have any place or claim on an undergraduate education. For Adler and Hutchins, undergraduates should be reading the great books, searching for revelations of the human soul in Plato, Aristotle, Thomas, or Shakespeare, and not subjected to the contingent claims of modern science. Now, while Adler outlined a detailed curriculum discoverable in neo-Thomist principles, Hutchins translated Adler's epistemology into a political project. Unless it is admitted, he wrote, that the natural moral law underlies the diversity of mores, that the good, the true, and the beautiful are the same for all men, no world civilization is possible, end quote. Hutchins' Great Books plan was driven by a democratic commitment that such an education should be available to all. Right? And he really did. He pushed, and Chicago still does this, these great books and prison programs. And Danielle Allen's book on the Constitution recently came out of one of those. Right? But what they wanted to democratize was the belief that the only hope for social and cultural order lay in shared metaphysical principles. Right? So a democracy built on the revelation of a metaphysical order. Now, one of the most trenchant responses to Hutchins' plan came from a young Chicago economist named Harry Gideonese. In 1937, Gideonese published a blistering review of Hutchins' higher education, accusing him of, among other things, attempting to impose, quote, an absolutist system of metaphysics on the undergraduate curriculum. Modern science, he claimed, had already freed itself from such systems. So whereas Hutchins, and I'm just kind of paraphrasing from Gideonese here, whereas Hutchins sought immutable ideas and indubitable first principles, Gideonese embraced the contingency of all knowledge in the face of empirical data. Gideonese was accusing Hutchins and Adler of epistemic hubris. This was a debate about facts versus ideas, and Gideonese even quoted Kant's argument that concepts without precepts are empty and precepts without concepts are blind. You need both, he said. But I think the lesson to take from this Chicago debate is that ultimately this was an argument about epistemic dispositions, about the virtues that attend to particular ways of knowing the world. In a modern world awash with data, no one scholar or group of scholars could legitimately presume the truth and unifying force of any one system. Hutchins and Adler, and the defenders of their program, were more interested in recovering a lost metaphysical system than informing the actual young men in front of them. But Gideonese lost the battle. Hutchins personally denied him tenure after the economics department had granted him tenure. And in January 1942, the Chicago faculty voted to adopt a new all-general education program, what soon became the vaunted Chicago Core. Of course, Hutchins and Adler took their metaphysically infused great books arguments national. They fought Dewey and the social frontier, and Adler, a former student of Dewey's at Columbia, continued to raise the rhetorical stakes of the debate, claiming in 1942 at a conference in New York that Chicago's faculty represented, quote, perfectly the disunity and chaos of modern culture. And in the closing lines of his lecture, he claimed that the Chicago faculty members who had voted against the program and thus rejected the claim that education must presume a rational and unchanging human nature, posed a greater threat to civilization, and I'm quoting here, than did Hitler. They had opted for cultural chaos. Now I want to wrap up here. So these laments for a lost curricular unity, and we could tell story after story about this, were elegies for a world undone by the fragmenting effects of modernity. Secularization, rationalization, and pluralization. Surveying these debates as an immigrant in 1954, Hannah Arendt observed that Americans had turned, and I'm quoting from her here, the general crisis that had overtaken the modern world into its own recurring crisis in education. The Americans had taken the crisis of modernity and made it a curricular problem. But to be fair, the Germans had done that as well. In 1877, Rudolf Virchow, the physician and anthropologist, had formulated the crisis, Germany's own educational crisis, in these terms. And I'm paraphrasing him here. How could scholars and teachers insist that their concepts, their doctrines, their claims become the subject of education and public knowledge if that knowledge is contingent? That is, how could they defend and institutionalize a knowledge that they knew was historically contingent in particular? This, of course, was simply a pedagogically inflected formulation of Nietzsche's attempt in The Gay Science, only 5 years later, to imagine a modern ethics that was both a radically self-conscious and brutally honest account of the contingent and historical character of all moral systems, as well as a positive affirmation on what it meant to be a moral human being. The task of modern ethics, and therefore institutions of education, he said, was to offer an affirmative account of how to live under the relentless epistemic anxieties of modernity. The pluralization of values threatened to undermine the stability of universities and all systems of education. And so the search for a unified, cohesive curriculum continues. And it certainly does at the University of Virginia. The debates at Columbia, Chicago, and Berlin haunted the curriculum committee I led, or maybe I should be honest, they haunted me. When my colleagues and I discussed revisions to our undergraduate curricula and considered the purpose of public universities, we returned to similar questions and raised similar concerns. We too lamented the over-specialization or the specialization of undergraduate education in our own scholarly lives. We too worried about the incoherence of our students' intellectual experiences, and we struggled to understand what might bind us together. We lamented a lack of unity, and we stumbled along through our deep differences. But unlike some of the previous debates, we sought neither to recover lost metaphysical principles, and nor did we deny our status as moral beings. We acknowledged that we, like our students, had conflicting commitments, that we believed in things called facts, and that we wanted to argue and discover these things together. And so in May, this past May, 83% of my colleagues in the College of Arts and Sciences voted to pilot a new curriculum based on this premise of our committee, and that then was spelled out in the first paragraph of our proposal, and I'm just reading the first sentence. A curriculum is not just a formal list of requirements, but instead an assertion of values, purpose, and commitment. Such a statement assumes, of course, that one, faculty members have such values and ideas about the ends of education, two, that they could come together and debate and articulate them, and three, that they could then institutionalize them as a curriculum. My colleagues did not vote, however, and you will probably not be surprised, to affirm a common and particular set of values and purposes. And my hope is simply that we will spend the next decades arguing about what these could possibly be. Thank you.
So thanks very much, Chad. That's terrific. It's very rich, and there's 10,000 things there that I could respond to. I'm going to try to confine myself. I'm going to tell a story which I think has the force of a parable. I'm going to throw a bomb, and then I'm going to run to try to get the bomb before it goes off and defuse it. So first, the story. One of the key moments in the transformation of Harvard College into Harvard University as we know it today was World War II and the events associated with World War II when James Bryant Conant was the president of Harvard. And Conant saw the war as an opportunity to raise the profile of the sciences at Harvard and to lower the profile of humanistic studies because the sciences, Harvard's high-powered scientists, could contribute in significant ways to the war effort. So he started a series of interactions with the government and with the military, which established a kind of a template for how universities might relate to the government and to the military, which still go on today in dramatically extended form. I'm going to talk about that again in a moment. So Harvard, in the period between 1941 and 1945, underwent a fairly rapid and significant transformation of its institutional priorities. In 1946, the Phi Beta Kappa Society of Harvard invited the poet W.H. Auden to come and give an address. And instead of giving an address, he read a poem that he wrote for the occasion. It was called Under Which Liar, and the subtitle was A Reactionary Tract for the Times. And he begins the poem by saying, Ares has quit the field. It's 1946, the war is over, but now a new battle has begun, and Auden says that the new battle is between the followers of Apollo and the followers of Hermes. And the followers of Apollo are those who wish to build a rational society. The followers of Hermes are those who know that they're not capable of building a rational society, nor are they much interested in doing so. He says, the world would, did Hermes run it, be like the Balkans. And so instead, they want primarily to be left alone. But they know that that's not going to be easy, as they are pressured increasingly to conform themselves to an Apollonian rather than a Hermetic model of knowledge. And so he concludes his poem with what he calls the Hermetic Decalogue, the first of which is, "Thou shalt not do as the dean pleases. Thou shalt not write thy master's thesis on education." Another one is, "Thou shalt not be on friendly terms with guys in advertising firms." And after he delivers his poem, he walks off the podium, and there is James Bryant Conant. And he said to a friend later on, he said, "I shook his hand, but as I did, I thought to myself, this is the real enemy." And I'm sure he thought the same about me. So that's my parable. Now, for throwing the bombs. Earlier, Chad had commented to me that when he was working with his colleagues at UVA on this revision of the general education program, one of the few things that they could agree on was that they were against neoliberalism, that there was a kind of a neoliberal takeover of the university, which all of them in one way or another resisted and disliked. And Chad didn't, as you said to me, I think, didn't disagree with that wholly, but didn't think that was the whole story. Well, I'm going to take up for and speak on behalf of Chad's colleagues who are against neoliberalism. I think they're onto something there, and you'll see why. Now, first of all, the word neoliberalism is little more than a curse word these days, so let me specify what I mean by it, at least. It is a political and economic system in which the ends and means of government are made subservient to the requirements of international capitalism. I think that there is such a system, and I think it is enormously powerful, and I think it impinges on universities in several ways. Perhaps the most obvious of which is, again, following the model that Conant introduced at Harvard in the 1940s, in which you have a symbiotic relationship between universities and large multinational corporations, especially tech companies. If you think about the intimate relationship between Stanford University and the companies of Silicon Valley, they're essentially a single interlaced entity in which it is virtually impossible to imagine a university like Stanford being genuinely independent of the powers of the tech companies there. It's a later version of the relationships between universities and what President Eisenhower in his farewell address called the military-industrial complex. Now the military-industrial complex sort of functions more independently, but the tech world is the one that seems to be interacting with universities in more and more complex and, frankly, to me, more and more troublesome ways. But all that is, I wanted to register it, but is beyond our scope here. I want to speak about three interlocking forces that prevent equally, I would say, schools like University of Virginia and schools like Baylor, one a public university, the other a private and Christian university, from achieving or even seriously pursuing the educational goods that Chad and many of his colleagues would like to pursue. So what are those forces? The first is the universally shared belief among American university students that if not the major task of the university is to prepare students to get good jobs. This is, of course, hardly unique to our context. It's something that Nietzsche talks about a good bit. In the lectures on education that Chad helped to translate and present recently, fascinating set of lectures, but also in a very closely related essay of his on the uses and disadvantages of history for life. There he writes that the goal of the education of German youth is, quote, not at all the free cultivated man, but the scholar, the man of science, and indeed the most speedily employable man of science. And it's interesting in light of the story that Chad told about the relationship about how the pursuit of knowledge got separated from the formation of character. I think it's very interesting that the word for science that Nietzsche uses there is indeed Wissenschaft. So Nietzsche is using this very dignified word in a rather dismissive and derisive way. Oh yes, we want the man of Wissenschaft. That's what we want, because the man of Wissenschaft, the man who possesses systematic knowledge, is speedily employable. But he contrasts that, notice, to what he calls the free cultivated man, freie Gebildete. From that most fascinatingly complex and rich of all German words, Bildung, right? The formation, education, right? So we talk in literature, everybody learns about the Bildungsroman, the novel of education. But Bildung means something more than education. It means formation, as your formation as a person. So Nietzsche, in that passage, is fairly explicitly contrasting Wissenschaft and Bildung. The Wissenschaft is the systematic knowledge. Bildung is the formation of someone who can be truly free, because his or her character has been formed, shaped in a particular image, right? Because that's what the root word is. Bild means image. Formed in a particular image, and therefore able to act freely rather than to be servile or bound. So Nietzsche seems to be suggesting here that you can be wissenschaftliche, you can be a scientific person and yet not be free, because your formation will not be adequate. I think that's very interesting. He suggests that Wissenschaft is compatible with the idea that university education is to get you a job. Systematic knowledge is compatible with that, but that the pursuit of true Bildung that would make you free, that's a whole different ballgame, and he doesn't see much interest in that in German universities. So for Nietzsche, Wissenschaft has become servile, and what it serves is the job market. The second factor linking universities to the neoliberal order is the massive investments, in several senses of the word investment, in scholarship-based sports programs. I think one of the things that has, Chad told the story of how the sports culture arose in the university as a kind of a substitute for, or the filling of a gap, right? When universities ceased to provide for students a common culture, they built their own, and they built it around football and drinking and around other sports, but football above all, especially here in Texas. And what has happened since then is the increasing awareness on the part of universities and various companies who are associated in one way with universities that you can monetize this culture. That this is a culture that can be extremely economically productive. And I think the more deeply embodied that understanding becomes within a university culture, the harder it is to disentangle genuine education from it. So when you have students who come to a university because they want to enjoy a good sports program, especially a good football team, and then after that get a good job, you've got two barriers in the way of getting them to think in a serious way about what education might be. And in case you think I don't know what I'm talking about here, I'm a graduate of the University of Alabama, okay? Whose legendary coach, Bear Bryant, once said all he really wanted was a university the football team could be proud of. And I think that so one of the things that I know from growing up in Alabama and from attending that university is that college football is a jealous god. It does not readily tolerate the worship of any others. It's, you know, frankly, I think Baylor is learning that right now. Or at least I hope Baylor is learning that right now and needs to think through what the implications of that are. We see that in many ways. I think it's very telling. Every university with a Division I sports program has at one time or another encouraged its faculty to cancel classes so that students could either attend or watch on television a sporting event. That's telling. Sometimes you can't park in your usual parking place because, you know, people are coming to the game. There are, not every day, not in every way, but I think, frankly, way too often, there is the implicit and sometimes the explicit argument that we need for the health of our campus culture to occasionally be subservient to the needs of entertainment, and the entertainment that specifically is provided by sports teams, is intimately tied up with an extraordinarily complex economic system. People have fun with this, but a lot of people make a lot of money from it as well. Though interestingly, not the athletes, at least not while they're here. So, the third and perhaps most powerful force linking universities with the neoliberal regime is accreditation. And frankly, I think this is something that we just don't talk about or think about often enough. The accreditation agencies that determine whether a given college or university is formally accredited are incredibly powerful. They are able to dictate much of what colleges and universities do, and they keep curricula confined to a narrow range of options, and do so, to come full circle, often by insisting that schools need to educate their students in certain ways in order to prepare them for the job market and make them good citizens. Right? So one of the things that an accreditation agency would not look favorably on was a university that tried to educate students to be, at least in Socrates' sense, a bad citizen, a gadfly, one who can't be counted on to support the current regime. And those accreditation agencies are are sufficiently powerful that colleges and universities are simply not willing to push back hard against what the accreditation agencies want, which means that to a considerable extent, we're deprived of the opportunity even to think in a really, really serious way about what it might mean to educate freie Gebildete students, right? Those who are freely cultivated and formed to be able to act wisely and well in the world. We can't think outside of that box, because to do so would be to risk financial and reputational disaster, right? Because you get in trouble with the accreditation agencies, and then students lose their ability to get certain loans, faculty lose their ability to get certain grants. You can easily find yourself financially weakened and intellectually isolated. And those agencies, they govern so much of what is possible within higher education, and they do so with virtually no accountability. It's an extremely troublesome state of affairs to me, but I also think an understudied and under-theorized state of affairs. That is, faculty, we're scholars, we like to study, we like to theorize. I don't think we spend 1/100th the time we should thinking about the intellectual constraints that we operate under because of accreditation agencies. But also, if just take those away, take those forces away that I have been talking about, the accreditation agencies, the incredible power of college athletics, the relationship between the colleges and universities and large multinational corporations. You take all these forces away and then ask yourself, what might we do then? What might our world look like then? A whole world of intellectual opportunities come into view that we're simply not even aware of on a day-to-day basis because we operate so comfortably under the constraints. We operate comfortably under them because nobody ever reminds us that they don't have to be there, that this is not simply the way things are, but that things could be different. In these circumstances, I'm inclined to doubt that any agreement on general education that could pass a cautious faculty, and university faculty are almost always very cautious, and a still more cautious and legally counseled administration is highly unlikely to be as intellectually dynamic as we want it to be, or to provide the resources to challenge the existing social and political order when it needs to be challenged. And again, I think that is equally true at a secular public institution like UVA and a private Christian one like Baylor. Though we may be different in our constitutions, we're operating under extremely similar, almost identical pressures and forces. So, not good news. But I'm not without hope. I think at the very least what is possible is small daily insurrections, the practice of dissident strategies, the cultivation of shadow cabinets. So that seems to set me in my account of things rather at odds with Chad's, and that perhaps has something to do with not so much the difference between our two different institutions, but our locations within the institutions, where Chad was chair of a major committee, and I'm kind of huddled over in my little corner in the Honors College, where we're just kind of trying to hope, like the followers of Hermes, that we'll be left alone to do the stuff that we love to do. But maybe the difference isn't that great. Though Chad was the chair of a major committee at one of America's most distinguished public universities, what he achieved along with his fellow committee members, and in the end, the whole faculty who signed, I can't believe you could get 80% of the faculty to sign on to anything. It's amazing. But what you achieved was something dissident and countercultural. They managed to introduce a tiny seed, a mustard seed, of moral language and moral reflection into an institution, American higher education, that because of its reflexive embrace of a handful of, again, under-theorized concepts like diversity and inclusion, words that are used much more than they are reflected on, are congenitally, it sometimes seems, constitutionally allergic to moral language. That mustard seed of moral reflection has been introduced there at UVA, and who knows what that mustard seed might grow into. Thank you.
I'll respond just very briefly, maybe to one thing, and do we have time for some Q&A? Thanks, Alan, as always, extremely rich. And what I would say, especially about, I said I doubted whether neoliberalism was really at the core of this, and because I doubted my colleagues who sat around the table, but I also doubt my fellow humanists around the world when they say this, because I think all too often, but you, of course, put your finger right on it, neoliberalism, whatever, let's just agree to use the term, and it may be a cipher for so many things right now. Neoliberalism, what it really is, it's an ethical disposition that has become a political and cultural structure. And I think what my colleagues, I'm going to sound patronizing for a minute, what I think they did not understand, but we together crafted a language through which we could conceive of it, is that the institutional and ethical effect of whatever this neoliberal moment is an egregious misapprehension of the good that education and knowledge might be. That is to say, in your story about what happened at Harvard, and we could go on about what happened at Harvard after the war, because it had already happened in Germany. It had happened when Cornell, it happened with the Moral Act, in 1864. Is that it did something that is an analog to this knowledge-ethics split that I talked about, or the Wissenschaft-Bildung split, right? It's the same story. And that's, it sundered the kind of good that knowledge could be. It reduced humanistic inquiry and ethical and moral inquiry to simply a private good. That is, moral reflection, moral formation is only good for individual persons. That's the only good it has. That's a great good. It's like, the read Jane Austen and change your life account of the humanities that my beloved and to the core disagree with colleague at UVA, Mark Edmondson. That's what he believes the humanities are about. You go, you read Jane Austen, you read Emerson, you read Thoreau, and you can change yourself. But he could give a shit about institutions or people or culture. He just is, as long as it can change individual lives. And to my mind, that is the most profoundly neoliberal claim that can be made right now, is that the humanities are simply a private good. Because you know what that leaves as the only public good? The sciences. And why? Because they produce economic utility. And I think that is the argument that I tried to make over the past 2 years with my colleagues, is that the real ethical and institutional and cultural and political effect of neoliberalism is to sunder public and private goods, whereby we have no capacity to imagine how a moral imagination, a moral culture, ethical claims could be good, not just for me personally, but for whatever culture, whatever time, and whatever place I happen to find myself in. And so now we're stuck making arguments about the humanities that, to me, are absurd on the face of them. Right? The humanities will simply change your life. Well, I think it's a really honest and good question to say, well, why should that be funded by tax dollars? Right? You're probably much better served going off into the woods. If we really want to make arguments about the type of education I think Alan and I would fully join together to try to pursue, then we have to understand these types of questions as public good questions. And we don't have the moral imagination to do that, or at least we didn't at UVA. And I think what happened, I don't want to say that my colleagues were snookered, but they had no language, but they were hurt, they were desperate, and they didn't know how to think their way out of it. And we helped give them some language, right? They had no idea who we were quoting, right? But we did it out of integrity, and we did it with this commitment that humanistic inquiry, the liberal arts, which is not the liberal arts aren't the humanities versus the sciences. It's an idea about liberal education in which a liberal education is a public good. And that was our argument. And neoliberalism, whatever that might be, effaces that difference and forces us to understand ethical questions as simply and always and necessarily only private questions and goods. And that's egregious, I think. So I'll just stop right there. Do we, you want to? Yeah. And I should say I love Mark dearly, but I mean, we disagree to the core about it. That's what
I'd be interested to hear that exactly more explicit about whether.
I'll do a first stab at it and then, yeah. No, I can't repeat the question. It's not possible. But it's a question about Adam is asking us to maybe complicate and refine the question of the relationship between the humanities and the public good. How about that? If we just do it, do it in a short version. Let's, everybody, when you start talking about liberal arts, you talk about education, you end up talking about Socrates in one way or another, and to some extent, it's cliched, and I always say I'm not going to do it, and then I end up doing it anyway. But I think one of the things that Socrates wants to say is to Athens is I'm of value to you because I do not meet your conception of a good citizen. That is, my public good lies in my ability to dissent from the standard model of what counts as public good. And there have to be voices like that. Here's another example. Donald Davie, the wonderful English poet and critic who died about 15 years ago. Donald grew up in a Baptist home in the north of England, and he has a wonderful book about the relationship between the English dissenters and the Church of England, in which he argues that the Church of England and its dissenting voices, the name of his book is Dissentient Voice, that the Church of England and the dissenting churches needed each other. That is, that the Church of England absolutely required the dissenting voices in order for it to formulate itself. And similarly, the dissenting voices needed the Church of England in order to clarify their own purposes. And this was something I was first alerted to a long time ago by our colleague David Jeffrey, who has written much about the dissenters, and pointed out, for instance, that at Oxford and Cambridge, where a dissenter like Isaac Watts would not have been allowed to teach because he did not subscribe to the Articles of Religion of the Church of England, the Standard Logic textbook was by Isaac Watts. He had produced a work that was superior to anything that they could produce, and they recognized the value of it even while excluding him personally. And I think Watts is probably just fine having it that way. So there is this kind of complicated relationship between the majority conception of what the public good is and the minority conception of what the public good is. And that majority needs to make room for that minority in order to clarify and strengthen itself. In that sense, somebody like Socrates is necessary to the health of Athens, and he would be less necessary if he were more in agreement. And I think that is something that often happens in people who are formed in educational models which are not the norm or the standard within a given culture. That even those who dissent most strongly from what we believe in need us more than they think that they do. That's one way to think about these matters.
No, I think that's great, and I would agree with it. And I would also just more globally say, I think that the history of the humanities, the history of the humanist inquiry, is a history of kind of permanent crisis with the demands of democracy and education. The humanities or humanistic education don't necessarily produce good citizens. They don't necessarily support democracy. Despite what all of my deans want us to believe at the University of Virginia, despite what, I think, Danielle Allen at Harvard, great political theorist, I mean, she's doing wonderful work, but she's making an argument about the necessity of the liberal arts for democratic citizenry. And I would simply say, and this is just a kind of a meta comment about Allen's comment, is let's be historically and conceptually honest and to say that's not a necessary relationship. You can argue for that relationship, you can try to institute curricula and make claims as to why it might be the case, but it's not always been the case. The humanities, the studio humanitatis in some ways, has been about making divisions, making distinctions, right? Teaching about models that are superior to which you ought to subordinate yourself. Those aren't comfortably democratic claims, but they're deeply humanistic claims. And those don't always jibe. They might, but we have to acknowledge it, and then we have to argue about it. But this presupposition in UVA is horrible about this. I mean, the only thing I can take credit for the committee we led is that we didn't quote Jefferson once. And for me, for some other personal reasons, but also for deeply, I'm really suspicious about this claim of democratic education, and I know like my dean and president would flip out if I said, but that's not what our curriculum is about, necessarily. So. In the back, oh, I'm sorry. I just took over your job. Yeah. Go ahead.
First of all, as a product of the corporate agreement, Columbia, and a social club student in Chicago, I feel this story.
Oh, wow, I just narrated your life. I'm sorry.
Basically.
Because then Hutchins got the committee go. He wanted to extend it to grad. So I cut out like 3 pages on the committee because it's always fascinated me because that's the next step. She's gonna be like psychoanalysis of you right now. Okay, I've got a snapshot. No.
Fair enough. So, basically, on the point you just raised, I think there's a deep tension in a democratic culture with providing reference points that aren't subject to logic. And this is why historically liberal education is conceived of as something that either the church or the aristocracy provides. So, what does this do in a country that doesn't have those other sources of wealth that can provide some logic that's not subject to the market and its infancy? And how does this work in forming community? Because you mentioned the restriction to the lost beliefs about the old American college, and that's true. But there are also some good reasons for that. If we want education to be free, to be leisure, to be liberal, it does require a foundation of love. And it also is easier to form community among people who share a common background. And that's part of what a college is for. Wilson at Princeton built the graduate college because he was still trying for this model of collegiality. So I guess I could argue as well that open borders and free migration of people is another logic that neoliberalism uses to say that in the name of everyone being free and open to everyone, what we're really doing is creating a constant flow of vulnerable labor that is subject to the logic of capitalism. So where does the wealth come from and how do we get into that?
I'll step back and won't immediately. I'll let Alan answer where the wealth is supposed to come from, because he's found it evidently. I would just say yes, absolutely, and I think yes, absolutely, because this is the argument. I think we might ultimately disagree about some things, but we at least need to acknowledge the profound, non-necessary relationship between humanistic and democratic inquiry. I mean, that was Nietzsche's entire project, right? And I was quoting from Hannah Arendt's essay called The Crisis of Education in 1954, and you probably know that essay. What she was doing there was a none all too veiled swipe at Dewey and his presupposition that liberal education is necessarily democratic. And you know what she talks about? She talks about Bildung. Bildung was never a democratic project. Bildung was always about subordinating yourself to authoritative images, right? A Bild is an image, imago, right? You have higher images according to which you are formed and formed into. And the first step in that, going back to 15th century Florentine humanistic claims, is to acknowledge that they are higher and better than you currently are. And that is not necessarily a democratic disposition. Now, I know some political theorists like Jeff Stout at Princeton has tried to argue that there is something like a humanistic democratic tradition. I'm less sanguine about that. But all I would say is absolutely we have to acknowledge that. And Alan, where do you get the wealth to study in your corner?
Well, I'll put it this way. Our Christian university, it's going to be huge. It's going to be the best Christian university.
Okay, good.
And all I need is for you to give me all your money. Then it'll be everything will go smoothly at that point. So I don't know, but I think that the question, I think the fundamental question is, can you make a market-driven society acknowledge values that are not market-driven? To acknowledge that the logic of the market is not the only logic. And the answer to that, it seems to me, is that you manifest an alternative logic in your daily life and in the way that you interact with other people and in the work that you do. That you try, for instance, to think in terms. My mind is full of ideas about this right now because I'm rereading what I think of as one of the most important works of fiction in the last 30 or 40 years, and it is Kim Stanley Robinson's Mars trilogy, his book Red Mars, Green Mars, and Blue Mars, about the first Mars colonies. And the reason I think that book, or there are 1,000 reasons, but one of the reasons I think that book is so fascinating is that when the colonists get to Mars, there are some of them who say, okay, it was multinational corporations working with the largest nations on Earth that got us here, but now that we're here, we don't have to do things their way anymore. And if we were going to build a more just and a better society than the ones that we came from, there's nobody to stop us. And what would that look like? And so you start getting people thinking, they're having these incredibly passionate and incredibly intelligent debates about the social order. And what you find there is one party of people who are thinking in a really intent and serious way about what a gift economy would look like, what an economy would look like that was built upon the giving and receiving of gifts. And if there's anybody who is well positioned to think about that, surely it is Christians, whose whole lives are built around the idea that they have received a gift that they did not deserve from God, and who are encouraged to give as freely as God has given to us. So I would say let's start from our own first principles and see what the world looks like. And if we can, and that's not something you can do every day, just as you can't introduce an entire moral framework into a public university in a day, but if we just thought that that was where we were going to start from, let's see what tomorrow looks like. That's how I would do it.
And just to pick up on that very briefly, I would say the question about the market is crucial, because I think we have to disabuse ourselves of the notion that humanistic inquiry, broadly conceived, has ever been free of financial and economic imperatives. I mean, look at the Florentine humanist curricula. What were they doing? They were ultimately training civil servants, right? We imagine them as free, open, inquiry-driven lives of the mind, but they were training lawyers to serve in courts. That's what happened in the 18th century Germany, right? And I think that's just a historical window that can help us understand the really complex history of those interrelations and imperatives, and we should not imagine, not this, I don't think this is at all what you're suggesting. I understand your story to jive perfectly well with this longer history, is that to imagine otherwise is to really kind of handcuff our conceptual imaginations. So, we had, in the back, you were yeah.
I'm Chris Noble from the Pacific University. I'd like to thank Chad for his perseverance and thank Alan for his unruliness, which I think is incredibly productive. It seems to me that you're having a debate between neoliberalism and paleoliberalism. And I wonder if the Christian conception of freedom as being free from oneself, being free from sin, might contradict both of those models, and whether a general education curriculum could be taught at a public or private institution that embodies that Christian tradition notion of what liberal means. Thanks.
Yes, that's a great question, and I'm sorry, I jumped in. So the question is about freedom and the different forms in which it might take. I think we would all do well to meditate on a regular basis on Augustine's comment at the very end of The City of God that the blessed in heaven are truly free because they are unable to sin. To imagine freedom as the inability to do something does violence to our everyday conceptions of freedom, and yet it is one that does strike me as being consistent with, as Chad was just saying, the notion of Bildung as the disciplined submission of oneself, which you cannot do in a day, but you must do over and over and over again, to an image to which you seek to conform yourself. And it's really interesting how I don't follow my former colleague Bruce Benson in calling him pious Nietzsche. I don't think he's quite at that point. But I do think that certain pietist traditions deeply inform Nietzsche. And one of them, it seems to me, is this paradoxical notion of freedom in which you become the freie gebildete person, the free, cultivated person, through a process over many years of disciplining yourself to a greater and higher good than anything that you can at the moment embody. So it's this model is not Christian as such, but it does seem to me to derive from certain Christian notions of freedom. And just as at one point you two said that Charles Manson had stolen the song Helter Skelter and we're stealing it back, I think it's time to steal back that notion. That is, that Christians can inhabit and revivify and correct what has gone wrong in the old notion of Bildung. And in a strange sort of way, Nietzsche is extremely helpful in that, because he already understood that freedom is the fruit of submissive discipline. Does that sound right to you?
Agreed.